Hello, this is Jurgen Appelo, CEO of Happy Melly, and I'm here to have a nice discussion with John Baldoni, who is the author of a number of very interesting books about leadership. His last one is called Moxie, and I want to talk about his insights that he shared in his last book. Hello, John.
Hello, Jurgen. It's a pleasure to be on here, joining you from. I'm from the U.S. and you're in Netherlands or in Brussels. So
I'm both in the Netherlands and in Belgium. That's correct. Hopping up and down all the time, John. What's the weather in the U.S. Where you're
cold today? We've got about 17 inches of snow on the ground, and it's 15 degrees Fahrenheit.
Ooh, okay. So I'm better off over here at this time. I thought it was cold right now, but
No.
you're doing that. Okay, you beat me there. So, John, you have a lot of books. I knew a number of them, but not all of them. And I quickly browsed through the Amazon website, but I was quite impressed. Which one is your favorite? Dare I ask that? Which one is your favorite book?
Well, you're entitled to ask that, but it's sort of like almost asking a father or a mother, what is your favorite child?
Mm-hmm.
I think that unlike when I'm a parent, I think we're most enamored of the last book we've done, so that would be Moxie. I will tell you that I have a personal favorite, which is my book on motivation, Great Motivation Secrets of Great Leaders. It's been out for more than 10 years, but it's still widely read and used in even graduate programs. So I'm quite proud of that book. But Moxie is where my heart is right now. So.
All right. Okay. So and this word Moxie, you described it at the start of the book where you got it from. I was curious. Is that a word where the word was there first, and then later you thought that was a good word to use, and then later you sort of connected good words for the acronym? Was it like the other way around? You had these 5 aspects, and you were trying to find a word that connected everything. Can you explain how that process went?
Sure. I've always the first explanation is the better one. I've always liked the word Moxie, and I became enamored of the concept. You know, as I talk in the book about, you know, in the movies, American movies of the 30s and 40s, we would talk about people who are down and out on their luck, and they would, but they wouldn't refuse to go down. They would fight back, and we'd say, well, that person has Moxie. And sometimes when we talk about Moxie, we tend to think of men, but I would have to say, since I dedicated this book to my daughter, who's a young woman pursuing her career and also going to graduate school, she embodies Moxie as well. So it's a concept that is for both men and women, but it's the guts, gumption, and determination. But I've always enamored of the word, and what it came to the forefront for me, I think, during the financial crisis, when we saw leader after leader. I wouldn't call them leaders, so they were certainly senior executives in the financial sector saying, you know, what do we do next, kind of thing. They showed a stunning lack of guts, a stunning lack of gumption, no courage, and no Moxie. So that was it. But absolutely, I was enamored of the word, and then as I explored how to do it, I said, how can I augment the concept? Because for me, I like to work in chunks of material. So I wanted to weave in 5 complementary concepts to embody what Moxie is all about. So I came up with, turned Moxie into an acronym for mindfulness, opportunity, the X factor, which is your character, innovation, and engagement. So.
Okay, well, that's those 5 aspects. I want to briefly touch upon each of those, if you allow me. To start with the first one, mindfulness. That seems to be like all the rage these days. There's not a book or a magazine that I can open nowadays without coming across the word mindfulness. Is there something going on in the world that you think that we now everyone touches upon this same topic? Well, what has happened at the start of this 21st century?
Well, I mean, the concept's been around. I mean, it originally probably comes from Buddhism, and so that's centuries old, of course. But I think it's gaining. I mean, it's been in psychology literature for quite some time. Ellen Langer has pursued studies in this, and a colleague of mine, Stu Friedman at Wharton, has talked about mindfulness. It's gaining credence now because I think part of it is people are looking for meaning. but also they're looking, we live in a very fast-paced life. Of course, every society says it's fast-paced, but just right now we are fast. And I think what's different to us is we're in a 24/7 global economy. What that means is a lot of executives I work with are literally on call because all hours of the day, there aren't very many boundaries, because they might have operations in China or in Europe or in the US, and so that time cycle keeps going and going and going. And I think people are saying, wait a minute, what's the meaning of life? What's my meaning? At the same time, so mindfulness is a kind of an introspective way. I think I have a little different twist on mindfulness because while it's rooted in self-awareness, and I talk a lot about self-awareness, I have expanded it to mean situational awareness, which is, and I think that's where a leadership perspective is, because it's not enough to be introspective. Leaders need to do that, but they need to know what's going on in my organization. And the mindfulness comes in and looking beneath the surface. What's really happening? What's not happening? And what must I do to influence the outcome? So that's where the situational awareness comes in, and it complements the concept of mindfulness.
All right. Okay. Well, that explains this rather well for me. And is it that nowadays in the 21st century, more and more people have more time to think about to think about mindfulness or to deal with the awareness than it was in the 20th century or earlier, when survival was at stake for many people? They were too busy to think about self-actualization and purpose. Is that part of the
well? I think in some ways, yes and no. I mean, the self-actualization that, of course, that the great father of psychology, or a great father, Abraham Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, put that as self-actualization as the ultimate goal. And I think people have always striven for that. You raise an interesting point. I think people don't have time, and so they're not looking for it, but they're overwhelmed. And so they're looking for, how can I navigate this? As a matter of fact, I quote a study in my book about surveying senior leaders, and it said only 20% of them were self-aware. And I think the study's a bit unfair, because I think that a lot of these executives are aware of what's going on. But what happens is they live in compartmentalized lives. They're other directed, which is good, because that's their job. Their job is to execute, to get things done. And so they short themselves. And you can only do that for so long. You need to get in touch with who you are, your emotions, of course, but also your capabilities. And good executives that I've worked with hire to their weaknesses. In other words, if they're not so good in finance, they hire good finance people. If they're not as creative, they get good creative people. If they're good creative people, they surround themselves with implementers, those who can execute, those types of things. So that's where the self-awareness comes in. That's where the situational awareness. So I think it's a sense of being deluged by what's going on, and people are saying, hey, time out. What can I do to improve my life? So that's where the concept of mindfulness plays, I think, in our society right now.
Okay, well, that makes total sense. What about the second letter, John? Opportunity. Is that sheer coincidence that it follows mindfulness? Because for me, in order to sense opportunities, I need to be more aware of my surroundings. Otherwise, I won't notice them in the first place.
I think
but could it be the other way around as well? What do you think?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, from the concept of situational awareness, you're looking out there, what's happening, what's not happening. And leaders must be opportunistic. They need to look for things to advance the organization. But this sense of opportunism is not so much self-directed, it's organizationally directed. What can I do for my teams? How can I help them individually, professionally? How can I develop a learning or a work plan or a professional development plan for my folks, and myself as well? You could throw that in there. But they have to be looking for this kind of a difference, how they can make a positive difference. And I draw in my chapter on opportunity, I take a little bit of a right turn. I draw on this the work that Adam Grant, who's a professor at the Wharton School in University of Pennsylvania, and he's done a wonderful book called Give and Take. And I spoke to Adam as I was doing research on my book, and and he's talking about those who give of themselves. And that's what people who mine for opportunities are look for. How can I create new opportunities for others so they can grow and develop themselves, and in turn enrich our team and enrich our organization? So that's where the concept of opportunity and how it complements this sense of situational awareness that I build upon in mindfulness.
Okay, that explains it rather well. This morning, I read an interesting question on Quora, the Q&A website of someone, an entrepreneur. At least the person said, "I'm an entrepreneur, and but I don't have any ideas." I thought it was a bit funny because I have the opposite problem. I have too many ideas, and I need to choose. So I think the mindfulness sort of solves that first problem of a person not having any ideas. But what about the second one? For some people, including me, it sometimes feels as if I'm running around like a headless chicken, hunting one opportunity after the other. What suggestion do you have for me there?
Well, you need to team up with the other person, and that's where complementary folks work better together. Now, in seriousness, what I would say is you need to prioritize. Anybody who has lots of bubbling ideas, with all due respect, I doubt that all of them are worthy. Of course, not taking a shot at you. I'm just saying some are worthy of pursuing. So by limiting yourself, and that's part of this mindfulness of honing down what's really important. What's important to me, and then what's important to our business. Now, from a business standpoint, you would do a case analysis, figure out what works for the business, how is it going to advance, what's our margins, all of the business case for that, and if it works, it doesn't. And from a personal sense, does this make sense for me to invest my time? And I think that this is where this lack of awareness comes in with leaders, is they get pushed and pulled in different directions. And they sometimes, if they're not disciplined, they get distracted by what the bright, shiny object. It's sort of the gold in front of them. Oh, I got to go chase that. And they become more like dogs chasing a squirrel rather than disciplined executives. And so that's where the mindfulness comes in. That's where I'm saying, hey, this is what I need to go. This is where I need to focus my energy. So it's a matter of focus, I think, and prioritization. So that's where that would come from, which in turn emerges from your sense of mindfulness.
Okay, so focus. I already knew that, obviously, but I like it that it stems from mindfulness as well. What about the third letter, John? X factor. I must admit, I went through your book and I found that one the hardest to comprehend. What is it? Can you explain that to me?
Well, X factor, I mean, I'm trying to make the X work, so let's be honest here. But X factor is your character. And character, you cannot lead anyone without any character. And what's character? You know, I've written chapters on it, I've written articles on it, coached it, whatever it is. The best definition I have for character is it's what you do when you don't think anyone's watching. You know, I think our parents taught us that. So it's doing the right thing for the right reasons. But character isn't something that we think about and worship and say and polish and put on the shelf. No, it's something we live. We must think about it and act upon it. And so as I dissect my chapter, I talk about the attributes of character. Courage is one thing. We all need to stand up for what we believe in. We need to, as leaders, we need to support our organization. We need to stand up for our convictions. We need to speak truth to power. Leaders also need to have a sense of compassion, all right? A sense of treating other people with dignity, with respect, regarding them as human beings, as resources, as contributors to my entity. Looking inside one, leaders must be ambitious. Now, ambition sometimes gets a bad knock because we think, well, he or she is just out for himself or herself. Well, that's not really what it is. It's about this quest to, if channeled appropriately, is making that positive difference, wanting to change the world, if we will. And that's ambition. And no leader can lead effectively without a degree of compassion. And of course, there are other attributes of courage and, resoluteness, those types of things. But also, I put in humor. I think, life is hard. We need to laugh at ourselves from time to time. Cannot take ourselves so seriously. And so humor is one of those things, the great leavening, I believe, in our society. And it's also a way of showing humanity. A leader who has a sense of levity about himself or herself is an approachable leader. People want to be around that person. They feel that that person is a real human being, and they want to associate with them. So I think humor complements the total sense of character, or X factor, as we say.
Okay, so I like the humor part. I think many people laugh at my mistakes, so I'm doing quite well there. And I like what you said about the character that is what you do when nobody is watching, or I would say what you do when you think nobody is watching, perhaps. It's a great description. But some words are best explained with examples. Can you name any global leaders that we all know that you think are a nice example of the X factor?
Well, I have the leader I chose for X Factor is I'm blanking out on who I chose for my X Factor, but the leaders I profile in the book all have a degree of X Factor. So, for example, Margaret Thatcher, who was former Prime Minister of Great Britain, she had that grit and resilience. Nelson Mandela, of course, I use as the mindfulness example. Sergio Marchionne was for innovation. Dolly Parton, of course, the great country music singer, and she's a person of great character and great depth. And of course, a golfer that near and dear to my heart was Ben Hogan. He came back from a horrific accident, and reinvented his career, became a better golfer than he ever was. And so these are the kinds of people that I admire. And there's, of course, the stories of the leaders that I talk about throughout the book, who shed light on what it is they did. And yeah, and I think it's a good example. When I think of character per se, if you say that, I probably would default to Abraham Lincoln, who was certainly one of our greatest presidents. And he led our nation when it was split apart. And I think the great thing about Lincoln was his humanity, a great sense of humor as well, but great sense of self, and was willing to sublimate himself for the goals of the country, to bring the Union back together and ultimately to eradicate slavery. So, but he was such a human, humble person, came from very humble circumstance, but never forgot where he came from. And people forget he was what we would say today, a very, very successful corporate lawyer. We don't know that about him, but in other words, he was a very smart man, a very savvy man as well. But he came along at the right time and led our nation in time of great peril. And I think it's through his personal example that he did sort of thing. So when I think of X Factor character, Lincoln is the one that jumps out to my mind. So.
Okay, I think that makes it perfectly clear for me now. I saw the movie Lincoln last year, and I was very impressed. I mean, assuming that they had a decent, adequate description and presentation of how it was at that time and how he behaved. I was very impressed with his personality and character. Indeed.
Right. The movie is pretty historically accurate as far as we can know. It's based on lots of research, of course, and previous authors. But I think one of my favorite parts of the movie are the fact that we see Lincoln arguing for his cause, but also his humanity, the telling the stories. And one of the actors, or one of the cabinet members say, "Oh, Mr. Lincoln, please, not another story," because he was that great storyteller, but that's how he got his points across. So it captured the humanity and the humor of the man as well. So that's a good example.
I like that. Innovation, the fourth letter, John. Why is innovation important? Because it is a word that pops up all the time, and maybe for obvious reasons. But there are some cultures in the world where not much progress has been made, and some people could argue that the people are quite happy. So why do we need this innovation?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, the old cliche, "Don't break it." If it's working, don't break it. That's valid. Innovation is really applied creativity, and it doesn't imply that we throw everything away and do everything new. And I think one of my favorite stories in the book about innovation is what is happening at Murano, which is the glass works in Crafts Glass Works, blown glass in Venice. Now, that business, I mean, for years, the Murano, which is just off the coast of Venice, was making blown glass work. Well, the cheap end of that stuff is all made in Asia now, so there is no demand for those little sort of tchotchke inexpensive things. So Murano has tried to move upscale, and what it's done is it's gone out to artists around the world and invited them to come to Murano and practice their craft, and they'll work with a glass blower. And so I think the wonderful concept, there's a word of, we want our artists to think in glass. And it's interesting when you think of thinking glass, I mean, because glass, our first impression is that it's very brittle, it's breakable, it's fragile. It is. But in a blown glass situation, when glass is heated, it's very malleable. You can move it, and that's a sort of a metaphor for creativity, because you can do things differently with glass. That, oh my goodness! And when it hardens, of course, then it becomes it stays true to that form. But I think the idea of this, 700-year-old entity innovating by bringing in new ideas gives us all you need to know about innovation and why it's necessary. And I think any organization, innovation, we don't always have to mean, break everything. It doesn't have to be disruptive. It can be those incremental things. And good companies are always doing things differently. And innovation should not be reserved simply for products or for services. Internally, an engineer removing a process to make things run smoothly, a customer service person finding a new way to satisfy a customer, a financial team, winnowing away things they don't need so they can focus on metrics that matter. Those types of things, all of those things are forms of innovation, and every organization needs that kind of discipline so that it can do what it needs to do.
I am in full agreement there, John. Innovation does not only apply to services and products, but also to the way we run our organizations, to the way we pay people, to the way we structure them in an organizational design or whatever we call that. There's so much people can innovate in this day and age. And that brings me to the last letter, the E of engagement. I think this is my favorite one. Because my purpose with Happy Melly and my fellow colleagues is to help people be happier in their jobs, which is all about engagement of employees and workers around the world. So what is your message for them in the 21st century? How do we get those horrible numbers of Gallup and others that show a very low engagement of employees? How can we get that up in the 21st century?
Well, it's a good point. You do good work, and I'm a fan of the stuff that you do, and certainly your book has lots of insights into engagement in there, and that's good stuff. I think the bottom line is the leader has to be involved, and I quote in my book an example from my own hometown here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Rich Sheridan, who has founded a company called Menlo Innovations, the nerd innovation in there, and that's one of the most engaged workforces I've ever observed. And the way they create engagement is everybody has a say in at least the work that they do. And it's a software development firm, but imagine this, it's every programmer does not have his or her own computer. They work in teams. That way they foster collaboration. One day a programmer might code, the other time the person is speaking, and it's vice versa. You switch it back and forth, and it's teaming type thing. So, but Rich said to me, he said, what you need to do to innovate, and I think it holds true to engagement, drive fear out of the organization. You have to give people a voice. You have to treat them as contributors, as resources, as partners, if you will, in the enterprise, so that they grow and develop the business. So it's that leader being intimately involved with what the business is and driving it forward. Interesting you like the engagement, because as I think about it, my book Moxie is really a twin, if you will, of a previous book I did called Lead with Purpose, giving your organization a reason to believe in itself. And that was more focused, most of the book was focused on what leaders do to drive purpose throughout the organization, with a final chapter on self-development. This book is the flip side of that. It's 4 chapters on what you do to develop yourself, with the final chapter, engagement, being how you bring it all together for your people. And so I'm glad that the chapter resonated with you, but I think engagement is that concept that we can't have enough of. And simply, you know, there are lots of $10 word definitions of it, but really what it means is, do people like to come to work, and do they enjoy what they're doing? It's as simple as that. And that's what a leader's goal must be.
Exactly, nicely phrased, and it just made me think of one of the other questions that I read this morning on Quora, which was, someone's question said, how can I make programmers work 60 to 80 hours per week? And I thought, oh my God, engagement would be the answer there. If someone wants to work 60 to 80 hours per week, then you have apparently engaged them somehow. And I wouldn't advise making people work that number of hours, but
no, as a matter of fact,
it all starts with purpose, I would say.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because software engineers are noted for logging long hours, but as Rich told me, and he's written in his book Joy Inc., they work a 40-hour work week. He doesn't, but the team does. And so they are very disciplined about their time. So it's 40 hours, and that's it.
Exactly. Exactly. So how do we use the technologies and our opportunities in the 21st century to engage in a new way? Do you see engagement differently now with what we can do as compared to the 20th century? Is it creating more opportunities for people to engage?
Well, I think it is. First of all, there's technology, so we can, you know, stay more closely involved with things. But at the same time, technology is a bane, because with our electronic media, we're always on. That fuels that 24/7 thing and clock. And so we sort of find ways to divorce ourselves. But I think, again, I'll get back to driving engagement really is a matter of prioritization. What's really important, and how do we strive for it? How do we avoid becoming distracted by bright, shiny objects? Or how do we avoid the roadblocks? How do we get around those things? How do we focus on what's really important? And when we encounter obstacles, do we face that obstacle because it's important, or do we go around it because it's not important? And so I think, again, it's prioritization, knowing where you want to go. And thinking that you'll, certainly for leaders, and I've preached this for years, as anyone who does in leadership development, it's not about you, it's about your team. And so what can you do to create conditions for people to succeed? I think that every generation presents challenges, because the way my children, the millennial generation, look at work is different from the way I was brought up. That's a good thing. And I like that. They bring an enthusiasm and a different perspective that my generation didn't have, and that's the way it should be. I think we have much to teach them, but at the same time, they can teach the rest of us, so that we, you know, go forward. They'll be the ones being the teachers of the subsequent generation. So.
All right, awesome. So that sort of concludes our 30-minute conversation, John. I'm very happy to have this talk with you, particularly because you're listed on so many lists of famous people. That's amazing. The 100 most trusted in the U.S. and the 50 experts around the world, etc., etc. You're doing an awesome job, apparently.
Well, you know, those things are fun, but I can't be reading the headlines. I got to keep focused on what's important, so that so I continue to. It's reassuring, because it means that people are reading my work, or listening to me, or inviting me to speak or coach with them, and things like that. So that's the positive. So it's very heartening, but at the same time, it's all about doing the work. And trying to make that positive difference, and however we define it, and I help people do that for themselves.
Exactly, and it's just confirming that people credit you for doing good work. So my compliments there. Is there anyone else on those lists that you admire and that you think that person
those folks. So I have a good relationship with them, and I admire the work they do, and I know it up close and personally. But here's something. People often ask me, who are the leaders that you see? And then when we talk about corporate leaders, it's always the list of usual suspects, that changes every 5 years or something like that. However, the one thing I notice is that I say, some of the best leaders are people you never heard of. It could be a high school principal. It's a baseball coach. It's a pastor in an organization. It's a middle manager in an organization. It's people at every level who teach us about what it means to prioritize, those who lead in social service communities, those who are making that positive difference. Those are people that I admire for leadership. We don't know their names, but every day they're doing their work and they're making the world a better place.
That's great. So maybe I should invite someone who is not on any of the lists but doing great work. I'll think about that. Thank you. John, you showed me earlier that you're sitting behind a piano. Could you give us a closing tune for this video?
Oh, I thought you'd never ask. So I'll just do a quick number here. Let me grab something. One of my favorite composers is, of course, George Gershwin. And recently had the opportunity to play at a piano. It's here at the University of Michigan, that George's third piano, which has now been restored, and it's being used by students and faculty at the University of Michigan. So it was a piano he bought in 1930. Sadly, he died 1937 or 38. So it was his final piano. And I'd like to think that he wrote some of his greatest music at that piano. But here's a song he probably didn't write at this piano, but I hope he played it. It's called, one of my favorites to play. It's called Somebody Loves Me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Applause.
Thank you.
Well, I envy you there, because I do not have talent at all in that dimension, but I can draw a little bit. So
that's wonderful. Keep that up. So that's
yeah,
good.
to each her own. Well, thank you very much, John. It was a pleasure having you on this interview. And hope to see you again sometime, maybe when I'm in the US.
I would love to connect, and thank you for all the work you do on that Inc. leadership list. It's an honor to be on there, and you have a wonderful book, and I'll endorse it, and you can't, but I will. So read it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.